My partner will be back any minute. She had to use the restroom. And here she is. This is a pretty good turnout.
Yeah, let me just tell Tammy, could they just do a last circle of 2 seconds?
Yes. I like how there's just like a big middle center of this that's like nobody.
Yeah, California.
Is Paul? Is that Paul School? Wait, no, it's not. There's a typo on the second page. It should be 3 minutes, not 4 minutes. Yes. Guys, there's a typo on page 2. It should be 3 minutes, not 4 minutes, for a team 2 rebuttal. It should be 3 minutes, not 4 minutes for team 2 rebuttal, because I don't know why it must have been. But we're fair here, so. We're the good guys. Come on. Yeah, we can talk. Let anybody in. Let them all in. They need to come in, but they can come in, but they need to come in legally. We're gonna have one big, beautiful door, and they'll all come in, but they'll come in legally.
I don't think we're gonna have that problem.
Is that kind of bad, bro? That's kind of bad.
That's why I come to class.
Okay, you don't come in a bathrobe.
I come in sweats and a sweatshirt. My hair isn't done.
Implying I go to class. Yes. Harry should be here very soon. He was hopping on the bus.
That's fair. So yeah, that pretty much cues into like everything. Oh, and this is pretty cool. I have the location. I take a picture of yours.
PBH, I'm surprised we filled up the room this much by 7:10 on week 10.
I have this. I have everything ready.
Just like let people in. If Tammy's out there regulating them.
Kudos on knowing everyone's name. Like, I can't remember.
I know everybody's name. They're in the chat. You're probably better with names
I
than I
know
am.
people's faces on
Fair enough.
Like,
Fair enough.
Is the mic? The mic, is it on?
Check, yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our debate hosted by Speech and Debate Club. We today have the College Republicans and the Progressive Student Union doing this debate. Before we start, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker that's going to give the introduction to why we're here doing this debate today and why the Speech and Debate Club is hosting this debate for a couple of minutes. And we are really excited to be here on this primary day doing a debate about something that's very important and prominent in our political society right now. So enjoy the debate, and please welcome Dr. Schoenfeld in a minute to give a speech. So before I begin, I would like you to be mindful of the fact that we are recording, so if anyone needs to enter or exit the building, to do so quietly, please. Thank you. Dr. Schoenfeld is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science in the School of Social Sciences and is also the former dean of the School of Social Sciences, and he served as dean between 1982 and 2002. He currently teaches undergraduate courses in micropolitics and also in the campus honors program. He has participated in hot topics debates that are hosted by the Social Science Dean's Ambassador Council for over a decade now. And he believes that it is very important for us to engage with controversial ideas and challenge our students' thinking. He recently participated in a debate that was centered around the resolution that all American adults should have a constitutional right to purchase and own a firearm of their choice. So we found it fitting to invite Dr. Schoenfeld this evening to give his opening remarks about what we do as debaters and the importance of what we do and the value of critical engagement across political and ideological lines for the education of all of our students. So please welcome Dr. Schoenfeld and enjoy tonight. Thank you.
Debate is central to a university. A university is not a church. It's not where you learn truth. It's where you're exposed to an array of ideas, and through that process, hopefully, your thinking, your understanding of the world improves. Now, we live in a society that is increasingly divided by people who all agree with each other. And we live in a society where people cluster with people who agree with each other. That actually is a tremendous loss, and hopefully one that those of you who are here this evening as students can avoid. Your challenge as a university student is to find someone who fundamentally disagrees with you and to become their best friend. And the reason that's your challenge is it's critically important in a complex society to understand that decent, intelligent people don't necessarily all think just the way you do. Decent, intelligent people have a right to disagree with you. And if you don't believe that, deep down inside of you, you don't believe a tenet that is essential for the functioning of a democratic system. Now, tonight we're going to have a debate. You're going to get to hear alternative sets of ideas. All of you probably come in with some notions on this topic. This isn't an obscure topic. You've got some ideas. I would urge you to listen especially carefully to the people with whom you most powerfully disagree. And ask yourself, are they saying something which makes sense? You see, if you don't do that, and I know probably just about everyone in this room, and certainly most of my Republican friends would agree with this, their model of civil debate is not Donald J. Trump. Their model of civil debate is very, very different. Now, if you close out the ideas of the people you disagree with, you're following the Trumpian model. A model which he didn't invent, but which he reflects. He is not a cause of the problem. He is the fruit of what has happened in our society. He does not believe in disagreement. I do. If you think that makes me progressive, so be it. I think it just as much makes me a Republican, because if you have people who have spoken up strongly and vigorously against that attitude, there are people like John McCain, Senator Flake from Arizona, and former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney. All of them expressed the view which should be held by all of us, whether we're Democrats or whether we're Republicans. And what's interesting in life is not having someone say, boy, are you right. What's interesting in life is being exposed to ideas that you disagree with, and either figuring out why you disagree with them, or saying, you know, there's something reasonable here. So I hope that doing your experience at your university, at the university, that will be something that you cultivate and work at. I congratulate all of you for coming out tonight. That's fantastic. I mean, there's so many other things that you could do.
Okay, yeah, fair.
Study, alcohol, drugs, sex, and rather you're here. That's fantastic. You've got your priorities well ordered. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our 4 debaters for leading the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schoenfeld. Before we go into the debate, I'm going to go over the resolution and the format of today's debate. The resolution today is the United States government shall increase gun control. The Progressive Student Alliance will be debating in favor of this resolution. The College Republicans will be negating. The structure of today's debate will begin with a 4-minute and 30 seconds constructive from either side, beginning with the Progressives. We will then move on to a 2-minute and 30-second cross-examination of the Progressives, followed by a 2-minute and 30-second cross-examination of the Republicans. Each side will then get a 3-minute chance to rebut the arguments brought up in the constructive, starting with the Progressives. We then move into a section of audience questions for 10 minutes, so if you have any questions you'd like to ask, I'd start thinking of them now. Then each team will get a 2-minute summary of the debate so far, again beginning with the Progressives. Finally, there will be a 5-minute block for audience questions again, in which we hope that you incorporate something that was said in the summary, followed by 2 final speeches, beginning with the Progressives, to give a 3-minute final focus for today's debate. That being said, let's start with today's debate. The first speaker will be Micah. You have 4 minutes and 30 seconds to begin the affirmative.
Evening, everyone. I'll be arguing for the affirmative. Should the federal government increase gun control? And I would say yes. The Second Amendment involves essentially what is portable property. The current patchwork of state and local laws is incompatible with one another. They're easily circumvented and frequently contradict one another in achieving their stated goal of public safety. Also, every state in this country of ours is not upholding its duties. The states are more or less taking away your rights, all of them. Some states have overly restrictive rules. Others are very thin. The Supreme Court of the United States asserts that self-defense is one's right, particularly one's household. And it's currently becoming incorporated with the 14th Amendment, and thus universal. Regulation is permitted within narrow purposes. And this is the decision of Heller in Scalia's writing. In regard to the 14th Amendment, state and local governments raise the majority of cases that come into the Supreme Court. The idea of an oppressive federal government restricting your rights to guns is largely a red herring. The federal government is uniquely positioned with the resources, the legal status, and capacity to do this. States do not have the resources to do so. So in many shootings, regardless of what laws are around, still occur. But the idea is to make it difficult for these, or more difficult for these to occur, while not infringing on other people's liberty. The federal government has the best capacity to institute background checks, issue permits, regulate interstate commerce, as well as international commerce. Everyone has a right. The vast majority of illegal arms that come into our cities with strict gun rules come from surrounding states and cities that have weak ones. This is incompatible. Every time that there's something in the news that comes up, we were like, but we had these laws and it still didn't work. Essentially Chicago, where the vast majority of weapons come in from Iowa. 80% of gun sales that end up being used illegally are sold by 1% of the dealers. This has also been determined by the ATF. There are, in regard to the pipelines for firearms, they're largely formed, like the East Coast has the iron pipeline, there's another leading to Canada, and the majority of guns in Mexico, as part of the drug war, come from the United States also. So essentially North America has an international, largely American problem. With the ATF in the straitjacket to regulate the manufacture, trade, possession, transfer, and ammunition used, the security of all 3 states is undermined. In the past year, we've had more children killed in school shootings than soldiers engaged in overseas combat. what kind of country do we want to have? So ultimately, we have to do our best to secure the rights and public safety without violating the other. And the federal government is uniquely positioned to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, debater. We will now hear the constructive case from the Republicans for 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
The college Republicans negate. Now, to start with this, I do want to preface my argument by going over that a lot of what Trump says and a lot of what he's going over is a form of pedagogy, right? He's engaging in a strict form of discourse because he wants to involve people. The majority of the population in the United States isn't directly involved. He is involving people. We look at the turnout in communities not involved before, and they're involved now. Now, going into our argument, we first want to philosophically frame this, debate. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, explained that, quote, "It is just that I should have a right to destroy that which threatens me with destruction, because it is the fundamental law of nature that men are to be preserved, and that when not everybody can be preserved, the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. Thus, it is our prerogative to select a policy that maintains this right within its inherency." First, gun control will empirically decrease violence on all levels of analysis. Subpoint A, crime. In 2010, James Lott, a researcher for the University of Chicago, published a third series of papers on a historicometric study of raw data between 1977 and 2005. And when controlling for a multitude of factors, such as average earnings, he found that there was a statistical decrease in crime, not increase, after the introduction of right to carry laws. And even if you don't directly believe that statistical testing, authors on the left concede an empirical decrease in crime when you control for a multitude of factors. For instance, researchers from the Liberal Journal of Legal Studies, such as Black and Nagin, attempted a state-by-state analysis, and they found that only 10 states showed a slight increase in crime proportional to the introduction of guns, whereas 15 states showed a significant decrease in crime proportional to the proliferation of guns. Worse yet, many on the left aren't even sincere in citing their own statistics. For instance, in Nagin's research, which I previously cited, 87% of the data on specific counties had been thrown out. So a lot of the academia being cited on the left really is just not honest. It's not a truly, aggregate conclusion given by the data. So when we look at the ends of this data, the argument that gun regulations decrease crime is a statistical myth. Subpoint B, mass shootings. First, despite the fake narrative pandered by media, school shootings are on the decline. In fact, using a study analyzing the FBI's supplementary homicide report, researchers found that 4 times the number of children were killed in schools in the early 1990s than today. Second, even a basic look at the empirical effects of regulation portrays insolvency. A study sanctioned by the U.S. Justice Department from the University of Pennsylvania, when analyzing the aggregate data from gun bans dating back to the 1990s, showed there was no statistical relationship to the context of legislation banning assault weapons and decreased shootings. Even if the numbers aren't convincing, most leftist scholars would concede that shootings involving assault weapons can be easily translated into other weapons such as knives. For instance, if you look at the FBI statistics, the number of individuals, I know you're laughing, but the number of individuals killed by rifles is less than 20% the number killed by knives. It's not significant. You're trying to make an issue where it doesn't exist. Thus, when we look at the actual data, when we crunch the numbers, it is simply empirically false to argue that gun regulations would prevent mass shootings in any way whatsoever. Second, owning guns is your constitutional and natural right. In District of Columbia v. Heller, which, by the way, my opponent cites, Justice Scalia wrote, I quote, that the pre-existence of a right declares that it, quote, shall not be infringed. Shall not be infringed is an obvious phrase in the Constitution. I shouldn't have to repeat it twice. The Supreme Court further ruled that the Founding Fathers intended this, with Alexander Hamilton reminding us that, quote, when able-bodied men are a nation trained in arms and organized, they are better able to resist tyranny. The purpose of this is not to go on hunting trips and have fun with guns. It's to oppose a tyrannical government. In fact, in McDonald v. City of Chicago, the court ruled that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment incorporates the Second Amendment right. And the court found that, quote, systemic efforts to disarm blacks were part of gun regulations. Thus, the college Republicans argue at the end of the day that the empirics and the rights favor opposing gun regulations. Thus, we negate.
Thank you, debater. At this time, we'll entertain a 2-minute and 30-second cross-examination of the negative by the affirmative. Time begins whenever you're both ready.
Do you guys have any questions? Yep. There's no prep. Shows a lot about the other side. Oh, let's just specifically ask them about, do you have any
Progressives, if you could please start your cross-examination.
What's that?
If you could please start your cross-examination.
Go for it.
So, all right. Firstly, John Locke did not grow up or live
Debater?
in the era that we live in now.
Debater, this is your opportunity to ask questions
my bad.
of the negative.
My bad. All right, let me see how I can phrase this into a question instead.
Do you have a question about John Locke? I'd answer that.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
In the 1990s, what do you have as like your proof that it is for certain tied to gun relation? Like what's the relationship?
So are you talking
there?
about like the aggregate data we looked
Yeah.
at? I cited like 5 different studies. Do you just want me to go over
Yeah,
the
but I want to
studies
know
again?
why you feel that that study says like the whole picture.
So you asked me why I believe statistics show reality. Is that
That's not what I asked. I was like,
So you asked- what are you
particular
asking?
fact- or-
So why I believe data
me-
shows reality?
let me help you with this.
Perfect.
Could there be other factors other than what the data suggests?
Okay. So what you're suggesting is that there's confounding variables. And as I already brought up specifically in my speech, it's controlling for a multitude of confounding variables.
All
So
confounding variables?
okay. Obviously, there's not a single social science article you could find that controls for every little thing in humanity. That doesn't exist. What I am saying is when we control for things like socioeconomic factors, which include, income brackets, local community living costs, things like that, that the data supports us. So if you want me to go down, what somebody had for breakfast that morning and ask if that affects if they're going to go shoot up a school, I clearly don't have that because it's impossible to do a study on that. This is just understanding how studies are done.
All right. Who is it that prevents further research and studies of guns being undertaken?
There are literally
Like,
hundreds of studies
so,
out there.
like who tends to hold hostage like gun research and gun study data?
Nobody.
That's
Is that your
interesting.
Yes, that is the fact. Now, there are certain groups that fund these research articles, but it's not like there's a vast conspiracy to censor academia. I mean, if there is a vast conspiracy, I assure you, it's on your side of the aisle, not our side. Is that time?
And then also,
Oh.
so mass stabbings. How many mass stabbings have there been? United States,
So
approximately.
are we specifically talking about the UK?
No, the United
article that I
States.
brought up?
Within the United
So
States.
the
We're
reason
staying
they're-
there.
Okay. Obviously, what I'm saying is, and what our argument is that when you get rid of guns, they translate into other factors. So, for instance, what we're going to bring up in our next speech is in the UK, when they banned guns, it translated to knife violence. So the violence is still there. It just translates into something else.
And is the knife as good at killing people as and efficiently and
I
as
mean, the
quickly
statistics
as a
would
gun
say
is?
about the same number of people die, but that might have to do with confounding variables, you say, such as immigration.
Interesting.
Thank you, debaters. At this time, we'll be hearing a 2-minute and 30-second cross-examination of the affirmative by the negative. Time begins when you're both ready.
I was kind of confused listening to your opening statement. I'm not exactly sure where you stand on specific types of guns. What are your positions on quote-unquote assault rifles and pistols? Are they any different? What would you like the federal government to do specifically for each type of weapon?
I am aware of handgun laws that restrict by age, but I really wasn't advocating differences in firepower.
Oh, okay, so what would you like the federal government to do? You just said that we should have the federal government deal with it. Well, what are some specifics and how would they deal with it?
Well, I mean, it's fairly obvious that your stated goal is self-defense, is not carried out by, say, like a 150 round box magazine. That's not self-defense. That's massive overkill. So I wasn't that specific about anything technical or mechanical, and I was actually just proposing
The argument-
that people get permits.
The argument that the United States government shall increase gun control, as far as I'm aware, in specific states like California, the magazine's limited to 10 rounds. So I'm not really sure why you're citing like 150 rounds, because that's already under the existing gun control laws.
Oh, well, I was using that, for instance, because there isn't a nationwide law. They all vary by states, and they infringe on each other constantly.
Yeah.
So it basically makes any research
Sure. Can you cite
or any attempts at
Can
law.
you cite a?
I'm finishing.
Okay.
If it makes any attempt to research or regulate like inherently flawed.
Please cite a single example where the argument of increasing gun control has worked. Just give us one.
Increasing gun control has worked.
Within the country or outside the country?
Anyway.
Where? Anywhere. Just give us an example.
Oh no.
Where are you arguing it's worked?
Actually, I mean, if you look at it in aggregate, my plan is actually to reduce the number of laws and restrictions.
No, we're asking where has gun control worked before? You were arguing to increase gun control, so we're asking you where, give us an example of a time when gun control has been enacted and has been effective.
Switzerland has a more intense gun culture than we do. People are responsible, people have permits, they're able to apply,
But
and
they
be
have
vetted.
less regulate. You have to argue for more regulations.
We don't have to.
Oh, I wasn't arguing for more regulation.
that's not-
I was arguing for a federal regulation.
Uniform regulation.
Thank you, debaters. At this time, we'll be hearing a 3-minute rebuttal from the progressives to the constructive of the negatives.
Are they using their time?
No.
It's okay.
Are the debaters from the Progressive Student Alliance ready?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can examine. Gotcha. Yeah. So when you cite right to carry issues, which I really wasn't speaking against, in fact, I don't know if I was clear enough, I wanted to expand. So in states that, what different types of carry laws are you saying are more effective, or are effective, or less?
This isn't questioning that you're speaking, it's a statement.
No. Well, which, say on the spectrum. If there's a spectrum of carry laws.
Well, we want people to have as many guns as they can have access to defend from a tyrannical government. That's the purpose. We went over that in case, and we discussed that with the Supreme Court. So yes, we believe there should be less gun regulations. For instance, bump stocks, which we do disagree with Donald Trump a lot on, because Mr. Trump has supported those. On the other hand, we also support, in many cases, your right to bear an AR-15. I think that should be totally legal. I don't think the government should have any business in that. So yes, we do support decreasing gun regulations.
All right. So regarding John Locke, regarding the classic literature on this, the Federalist Papers among it. So
Wait,
who was, in this case, who was resisting what tyranny?
Yeah.
Okay, so are you talking specifically about the case? Is I brought up about discrimination against blacks, for instance, which I brought up in the Chicago case. Is that what you're asking about? It's unclear. Or are you talking about Locke? Locke's talking
I'm
about
talking
an
about
actual
the
experiment, a thought experiment with nature. So Locke isn't citing a specific empirical example. If you want the specific empirical example, you have to look at the cases I cited. But what are you asking about? It's very unclear what you're even advocating for.
So I just wanted to know
Who's tyranny? What is tyranny?
where's the tyranny coming from, and
Give me an example.
who is it directed at?
Okay, so specifically the framework for tyranny is a system that has no way of adjudication. So you have no way to submit your grievances, petition for them, and then fix them. If that system does not exist, then you have a tyrannical government, in which case it is justifiable to use violence against that tyrannical government. The United States is not at that place at this time. I would say in the days, for instance, if we go back to Brown during the Civil War, I would say if you were a slave, you had a right to violently resist the government because you had no way to petition for your grievances. I would say that does not exist at this time, but it could, and I see it happening in a potential future. For instance, should a far leftist government get in power in Washington and suddenly declare that free speech is no longer a thing, and then we can't advocate, I would say violent resistance against the government is justified.
So how does expanding background checks, training, knowledge of safety, how do these things create tyranny?
Thank you, debater. At this time, I'm going to give the floor to the Republicans for a 3-minute rebuttal. Time begins when you start speaking.
Yeah. Okay. What's your one?
Where are we at on this list?
Oh, no, I should just know that.
So I want to start by addressing a couple of your points. You talked about the Second Amendment being about affordable property in your opening speech, which I find really weird, because the Second Amendment is about, making sure that you can protect yourself and you have the right to self-defense and a right to self-defense against others and a right to self-defense against the government. So that's sort of the first thing I want to clear up, is that what the Second Amendment is actually about. You talked about the federal government restricting rights as a red herring, and that's not true at all. So the National Firearms Act actually restricted our rights to own these types of guns. Short barrel guns, that include shotguns and rifles. You can't have machine guns, and you can't have silencers. So that would be technically considered military-grade weapons. So the AR-15s, they're not military-grade weapons. They're 22 caliber rifles. You're going to get killed if you're in combat using one of those. You talked about mass shootings. So I'm really tired of people always blaming the majority of people who law-abiding American citizens for stuff that the minority of people do. Our counter is simply this. When the FBI studied 37 active shooters between 2007 and 2012, they found 80% of the shootings involved individuals close to the shooting, knowing their intention but failing to report them. I believe that if we dig into more of that, then we'd be able to fix more mass shootings before they start, instead of punishing the majority. I'm the majority. I'm a law-abiding American. I've never committed a felony or a serious crime. Every time there's a shooting, everybody wants to blame us and not the shooter. But you want to put the blame at my feet. You want to turn around and restrict my constitutional right to defend myself and to purchase a firearm. So with us, the law-abiding Americans are the first people attacked and the last ones considered. So you take our guns away, and people like me, we're going to follow the law. Go ahead and take them away. But those gangbangers, they're not going to follow the law. They're going to come, they're going to break into my house, and I'm going to be defenseless against people like that. We need to focus more on mental health and focus on blaming the shooters and not the law-abiding citizens. States take away our rights all the time, especially in California. In California, our ability to own guns is basically neutered compared to other states. We're limited to 10 capacity round rifles. We can't own specific types of gun unless there's a magazine lock on them. It's completely ridiculous. I want to talk about an instance of gun control which has been completely ineffective, a couple of them. One of them would be in Australia, where the banning of gun has actually led to violent black market. So unauthorized pistol possession has increased by 42%, matched by an 83% increase in firearm offenses, which is even more frightening when you consider a 300% increase in pistol-related offenses in South Wales. So even if you don't believe any of this, there's no actual empirical evidence to suggest that the policy has worked, because there's no statistical evidence of a relationship between gun buybacks and a tangible reduction of firearm deaths. Going into Europe, which everyone always cites, knife crime in England and Wales has increased 11% on the previous year of a study recently conducted. The National Health Service data showed a 13% rise in increase in hospital admissions for knife wounds.
Thank you, debater. At this time, we'll be moving into 10 minutes of audience questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand now. No one? Yes, in the front.
Questions?
Please.
Thank you for the opportunity to attend this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for being here.
It's, first I must ask clarification. You're asking for increased regulations when it appears to me that the Second Amendment says the federal government shall not increase regulations. Is it your contention that when it says the people, they were referring to the state?
Like who the target of the
Well, it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Is it your position that when they said the people, they meant the state? Because if it's the people, that clearly you are saying, the Constitution is saying do not regulate these. And if it's your position they shall be regulated, I'm wondering how you square that.
I can run this.
Go for it.
So based on the case law, the right is not unlimited, like many of our rights.
Yeah, because like for speech.
Well, I guess my question was, though, are you saying that the Second Amendment is a right of the state to regulate guns?
It's a right of states composed of the people to resist the central government, as I understand it. So it's not necessarily individuals facing off against the government. We're not having it's not an action movie. It's a very serious matter. We're not talking about the saying blue lives matter than saying in the next instant that we have a right to shoot police officers.
On a basic level, does the Second Amendment speak to the people or speak to the state?
Thank you, debaters. At this time, we're going to be moving on to a second question. Would anyone like to ask a question in the audience? In the back.
Let's hear both sides' positions on defensive gun use. I don't know if either side is familiar with it, but I've heard there's noticeable lack on both sides of the aisle. People talking about defensive gun use. Estimates range from, on the low end, from about 3 times the amount of people that are killed every year by guns, which is around 18,000. To the lowest estimates of defensive gun use, someone using a firearm in defense of their life are ranged from around 55,000 to 2 million. So I'd like to hear both sides talk about how that plays into this.
Repeat the question just one more time so I got the clarity.
Defensive gun use is when an individual uses a firearm to defense of their own life or wealth or property. And estimates for that range on the low end from around 55,000 per year. And mind you, 18,000 people are killed by guns every year. So the lower end estimates of BGU are about 3 times how many people are killed every year, and high end estimates are up to 2 million. These are up to 2 million Americans who potential gun regulations would take guns away from them and leave them susceptible to crime. So I would like to hear what you guys think about that.
All right. If I may. Essentially, we are not trying to ban all guns. This is something that tends to happen a lot with our discourses, that people assume that like some attempt at regulating something is actually to take away all of it, and we are only saying that we need to regulate and have federal government act as the unifying regulator rather than having all the states picking opposite laws that will contradict each other and create hazard to public safety. Because if like your neighboring state has no gun laws and you have all the gun laws, they can just bring guns over and then like bad guys get them, right?
So would you be open to a
We're actually going to hear a response from the Republicans at this time.
Please.
Great. So if I have a criminal who comes into my house and he's got a gun, he's got a weapon, and I have a knife, who do you think is going to win? Now, if I hold on. If I also have a pistol to defend myself, or I've got a shotgun, or I've got a weapon of the same sort of amount of caliber that he does, then I'm going to be able to defend myself against this person. So you're arguing that you're not trying to ban all guns. Okay, that's a valid argument, except you follow it up with regulation. You want regulation, which is the point. That's the point that we're trying to make, is that these people who are committing the crimes and who would harm you, they don't care about laws. They don't care about the laws because obviously they're breaking it by trying to harm you. They're not going to follow these regulations. It's going to be the law-abiding citizens that follow the regulations, and they're going to be at a disadvantage for these people that don't. And you are harming the law-abiding citizens in favor of these people who just don't care about about the regulations that you're going to in place.
Thank you. We'll now hear another question. You in the front in the yellow.
Hi, this is for both of you guys. So, whether you negate or are for federal gun control laws, my question for you is, how, as an unarmed citizen, are you guaranteeing me equal protection under the law as an unarmed citizen?
So is that a 14th Amendment question, like due process?
Second Amendment.
So it's a Second Amendment.
So you're saying, like, if somebody else had a concealed carry?
I'm saying, if I'm in a public space,
Okay.
how are you guaranteeing my safety?
Okay, thank you.
Because right now we have a problem with mass shootings. It's not just about
Yeah.
gun control.
So a couple answers to this. First off, we already showed you that no, mass shootings empirically on the decline. In the 1990s, 4 times as many people died of mass shootings as they do now. And then on top of that, when we look at the FBI statistics between 2007 and 2012, 80% of the shootings that involved individuals close to the shooter knew about his intentions. So the problem is a mental health problem if you're just talking about utility of the policy. Now, if you're talking about, Second Amendment has nothing to do with equal protection under the law. That has to do with a different amendment. The Second Amendment specifically dealing with your right to bear arms, protect yourself from a tyrannical government, which I would say is a fundamental part of the law because you can't oppose a government if you have no, mechanism to do so.
We will now hear from the progressives.
I mean, that's precisely what my policy was to target. I mean, we want guns in the hands of responsible, we're basically creating a difference between good owners and bad owners. And I thought I made that abundantly clear. The issue is, you want to keep firearms out of people who shouldn't have them. Currently, we have kind of a black market system that circumvents a lot of this. It's fed by gun sellers who, it's probably about 1% of vendors supply 80% of the illegal guns. This data, the government does have it. Can't research it further. All funding has been stopped. The ATF is prohibited from making recommendations about who to go after. So I don't see, in aggregate, we have to just reduce negative events that kill people.
Can we respond to that? That's pretty.
But also,
that's an outrageous claim.
Debater, please let the progressives finish.
Yeah. So we have to respond to negative events, but I don't see a regulation that could stop any individual shooting, and if someone can think up a way to limit deaths in the first room or the first space, because there are many ways to do it from the second space, or to retreat, or fortify yourself, but no one can take away the element of surprise.
Thank you, debater. We're going to move on to another question at this time. Are there any other questions in the audience?
Lots.
Hey.
What?
This guy in the sweater's had his hand up for a while.
All right, in the OCC sweater?
Yeah.
Yes, ask your question.
I have a question for the progressives. Yes. So what do you guys clearly want to regulate? Like you say you want the federal government to create clear laws for everyone to follow?
Consistent.
What would you guys
The laws.
ban, or what would you guys have regulated? Or
Now, are you asking our personal opinion? Because honestly, that's something that the democratic society would have to decide as a whole.
your
But
opinion, or the
not answering the
progressive society, or just what are you guys trying to accomplish?
okay, essentially, I'm going to speak on this because I've had this debate a lot. The goal is to remove high-power weapons as much as possible. We can't they bring up crime and stuff. You can't stop all crime, and the laws aren't designed to stop all criminals. It's to minimize harm and act as retributive force. So, it seems kind of unnecessary. And the 1990s shootings thing is kind of irrelevant to what's going on now. We're having another set of shootings. How is that gonna, just because that's one isolated point. If you have other periods in history where you oh yeah, the shootings went up or down or something. Yeah.
I'd like to remind everybody that the National Firearms Act is already passed and military-grade weapons have already been outlawed. So you're advocating for policy that's already enacted. So I'm really confused about what it is exactly you're trying to outlaw. If you're trying to outlaw stuff like AR-15s, that's a semi-automatic .22 rifle. It's not a combat rifle. It's not a high-power rifle. Already outlawed.
I can answer
We're going to move on to the next question.
I'll let you handle this one.
Up up front here in the flannel, go ahead. Yeah.
So it's for the progressives. So as she just said that it's already banned, and so when does regulation stop?
Okay, that's fair.
And then, because I personally believe that the ultimate goal is banning guns on the progressive side, which they're not ultimate long-term, they're not going to say it.
Yeah.
However, because the thing is now in London, now there's a knife ban. Like, when does the regulation stop when it comes to protecting oneself?
I mean, guns are here to stay. This is America. We're not talking about banning guns.
We're not talking about
I'm not dealing in hyperbole about long-term conspiracy or something like that. Or
Conspiracy, I mean, it's happening in London. It could happen in America.
that's it could. So you're saying you're using hyperbole? No, I'm actually trying to create a more robust law that preserves the right.
But what law? High-powered weapons are already banned. So what?
Oh, I wasn't going after high-powered weapons specifically.
Yeah, that was my
I want to bring up the
finish
point
my
that the Democrats have this tactic.
Debater, please let the progressives finish answering the question.
Have they not finished?
I thought I finished.
Well, I was gonna throw out that when he asked about like the high power stuff or like what amendments I would or suggestions I would put forward or whatnot, it was my personal perspective that you should probably limit high power weapons because it seems like certain demographics have those weapons and there's not a gun equality. I mean, if you want to have guns, you want the people to have roughly the same weaponry. So if you remove high power, I mean, at what level of power do I like? How powerful does my gun have to be to beat the next person? Because there's no limit to how much higher I have to go to one-up the person next to me. There should be a limit that the federal government imposes. Yeah.
At this time, we'll hear a response from the Republicans.
Sorry about that.
I would like to bring up the fact that it's the Democrat tactic to slowly enact regulations so that if you do it, obviously if you do something all at once, many people are going to be outraged. But if you do it gradually over time, there's less and less outrage spread out over that time. You can see this is a perfect example in California. Governor Jerry Brown has stated that he would like to make every highway in California a toll road. This has already started. You see a lot of toll roads in Los Angeles. Up until 2022, the 405 from Harbor all the way to Long Beach is going to become 2 lanes of a toll road, and then they're going to make it 3, and then they're going to make it 4, and then they're going to make it 5, until all of the freeway is a toll road. They're going to do the exact same thing with guns. It starts with the NFA, then the next is AR-15s, and the next is pistols, and then who knows what else.
Thank you, debater. At this time, I've got a question that I would like both teams to answer for 45 seconds, beginning with the progressives. In the instance that public safety and individual rights are in conflict, which do you believe take precedence?
Great question. Public safety, I would say. Because at the end of the day, we're not, if we lose the society, we lose everything. If the individual loses something, they might be able to recover that. But the society's gone, we're all fucked.
I would say that the right isn't being carried out properly. Or it's not understood, it's not exercised. And that's detrimental to public safety. So, I mean, we're in a way talking about a similar thing, but maybe a slightly different approach.
Yeah, we can balance a lot of these things. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game all the time.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. And the Republicans?
Very quickly, I just want to ask what defines public safety? Because to me, living in a high crime neighborhood, that's a public safety concern. I would like to have a firearm to defend myself. And Kimo's going to argue the other side of that argument.
Yeah, and even utility there, think about it. The Progressive Student Union always distrusts police, yet they want to take away everybody's guns. And that's where we're talking about rights here. So allow me to give you an example here. If you have a tyrannical government you believe is attempting to systematically take away your rights, you need to oppose them. What public safety is not only a utility question. Public safety is a rights question. Because if you live in a society where you have no rights, then there's no point in living in that society. You must change a society that is fundamentally unjust at its fundamental nature.
Thank you, debaters. At this time, we'll be moving on to a 2-minute summary from the progressives. I'd like to add that there will be another 5-minute block of audience questions after these summaries. So if you have more questions, keep them in mind. We'll get to them. Time begins when you start speaking.
All right.
Mentioned the red herring and slippery slope.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to create a stronger, more robust, more balanced, better recognition of rights, and better public safety measure. I'm not talking about knives. I'm not talking about murder in general.
Or bans.
I'm not talking about banning. I'm not talking about socioeconomics. I mean, those are a lot of these things are pieces of an argument that may or may not have a bearing on a situation. I think the federal government's better able to determine this through our representatives than local interests or state interests. They've done a terrible job of it. The incompatible jurisdictions and overlap is hampering both the right to bear arms and public safety. It's increasingly becoming a multi-state issue, an international issue, and there's very little accountability, and it's become a political football. Regardless of what people's stance on it is, we're sitting here quibbling over details and partisanship, or the Republicans are trying to do this, the Democrats are trying to do this.
Hypotheticals.
Yeah, it's all very hypothetical. Meanwhile, legitimate gun owners are injured by the policy, and illegitimate gun owners are
Able to capitalize off of it.
are not seemingly slowed down, and that's a threat to public.
Yes, and we call that tyranny. Not just the government can create tyranny. We can create tyranny for each other on the individual level.
That'll be all.
Yeah. We can move on to the 2-minute statement from the Republicans. Time begins when you start speaking.
All right, so let's just go over the first claim they made, which is absolutely outrageous. They claim that research is being banned. For one, the CDC actually faked statistics. Like, they faked their methodology. They had a ton of problems in those studies. And yes, I understand there are studies, by the way, and I know the professor's looking at me and shaking his head. There are studies out there showing your point. But I disagree with their methodology, and we went over it. You couldn't even bring a single study to the floor of debate today, which is the problem here. One point the Republicans want to make is the fact that we have to defend our standpoints at the cost of our careers. And when we can't defend those standpoints, we're called bigots. That's why we have so many empirical arguments, because if we can't defend it, then we're the ones being screwed. If you are, for instance, a liberal Democrat at this school and you don't defend your stance, the most you're going to get is a C on your paper. But if you're a Republican, you can't defend your stance, you're being dragged before Title IX office for disagreeing with their opinions on due process, which, by the way, has happened at UC Santa Barbara. Now let's just go on to our specific case. The first contention we talked about on decreasing violence. We showed in the Lott 2010 evidence, he's a researcher from the University of Chicago, that if you look at the aggregate data from 1977 to 2005, guns decrease crime. That's simply a fact. And they haven't brought up a single argument when I asked them in cross-examination, give me a single example where this has worked. They couldn't name a single one. They stood there and muttered for 15 seconds. We talked about, mass shootings. The FBI supplemental homicide report, if we looked at this, showed that 4 times the number of children were killed in the 1990s as were today. There's clear evidence that this problem does not exist. It's simply a statistical myth. And then on top of that, what's most important today is your constitutional rights. We talked about how a lot of times the intent of the people creating gun regulations was the systemic discrimination against African Americans and blacks in an attempt to disarm them in their communities from opposing a fundamentally tyrannical government. The court found that McDonald v. Chicago, City of Chicago, it's a fact. If you want liberty, if you want freedom, you oppose gun regulations at all levels.
We'll now move on to our second and final block of audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand now. Yes.
For both teams, what's your stance on doctor-patient confidentiality? So, do you think that a government regulator should be able to request information on mental health without subpoena or due process?
Regarding guns.
They're already at some place to prevent that.
Mental health, should a government regulator be able to ask your doctor questions about you, is what I'm saying, or demand information about you?
So are you trying to ask if there could be
Conflict of interest.
like kind of it's been discussed that there could be a quick to obtain warrant in the event that someone is exhibiting intent and someone knows it and is reporting it, and we've seen that in a few shootings where it was reported but not really heeded. And so maybe we need some interlocutor to put a stamp on that. So I think that should be pursued or investigated.
All right, so it is the official position of the Republican Party that mental health checks are important, but there has to be restraints on them. A government bureaucrat can't go to any random person and ask for it. There has to be reasonable cause. And that's why we have a court system where you can go to the court system and you can get a warrant to get that information. That's part of what the Constitution intended. You have rights, but you have a due process right. And those rights can be taken away if we believe through due process that you are a fundamental threat to public safety.
Is there another question in the audience? In the front here?
Okay, so I would like you to respond to me bringing up the issue of, as a citizen, I have an inalienable right to life. I have an inalienable right to be in this room and to be safe and not be afraid that somebody is going to take my life. You brought up something, you said something in regards to that mass shootings are a myth, but we all know.
I did not say that.
And you said something along.
I did absolutely not say that.
Yeah, we said it was a statistical
A
improbability.
statistical myth. Well, we all know right now.
Statistical myth is not a word.
You said.
Okay.
All right.
And I'm saying, we're all in this room, and we all know when we go in public spaces, that we are putting ourselves at risk because of the current climate. And I'm asking you, I feel like you guys are putting the Second Amendment, you are so concerned with protecting the Second Amendment that you're infringing on my right to be safe in a public space.
Do you know what gun-free zones are? They're safe spaces for criminals. It's because everybody in here, they know that they don't have a gun. So somebody comes on a campus where they know it's a gun-free zone. They know nobody here is armed, but a couple of campus security people. People being able to carry weapons with them guarantees other people's safety. As obviously, of course, there is a very vigorous background check, very vigorous process where we make sure that they're trained before they're given a concealed carry permit.
Please let the debater finish their response.
Our statistics cited, please let me speak. You asked me a question and I'm answering it. Our statistics cited that over 80% of mass shootings involve somebody close to that shooter who knew what they were planning and they said nothing. I believe that if we want to stop the mass shootings, we can start with that. We can start with promoting if you see something, say something. That is the first step that needs to be taken.
We're going to move on to the next question. In the denim jacket.
Yeah, it's called the National Firearm Act.
Yeah, so I myself have an AR-15 Act. I believe that the tech line of the government works by the government. I highly doubt that with my AR-15, which is basically citizen-made, would defend myself properly against the government. It's very imbalanced. However, I don't agree entirely with them. I'm in favor of weapons, so I mean, so would you go about that?
So first of all, an AR-15 is a perfect civilian weapon because it's easy to use. And it's a very efficient weapon. It's a very reliable, efficient weapon, easy to use. So it's a great civilian weapon. I would personally like to repeal the National Firearms Act because you're right. If the military ever comes, if we ever have to fight against the military, then we're going to have inadequate weapons in order to defend ourselves with. So I believe my time is up.
If the progressives have a response.
You want to respond or should I?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned many times that I'm for self-defense of the person, of the home. I didn't specify weapons. I didn't say what should be done. Like, I don't think that seizure should be a thing. These are largely results, like it's de facto seizure. They make part of your gun or a trait that it possesses or design to be illegal. That's almost a de facto seizure. So I'm not for seizures. I am for the right of self-defense, and I don't think the idea is to resist the federal government per se. I think that the existence of the Second Amendment somewhat puts a wall between us. As far as that defense, it's unique to the United States, and also that a lot of that is for the states to do. The difference between the Bill of Rights and the Constitution is that the central government was added, and the Second Amendment is a check on central government primarily through states.
At this time, is there a question for specifically the progressives? In the back in the baseball cap?
You spoke a lot about states' rights, and I kind of wanted to ask a question regarding that. So currently, it is the federal law that
Yeah, actually, the thrust of my bill is that I'm against states doing that. So, I mean, I said at the beginning of my speech, every state's limiting your freedoms in this respect. Some do it more, some do it less. I'm not talking about more regulation or less regulation, because there really isn't a such thing. It's just regulating for different parties and adding privileges to other parties and disenfranchising others. I want that to be a median in our society. I want that to be universal. And depending on which side you fall on it, you're still attenuated to it. So some of these laws are pretty superfluous. They're silly, they don't work, they haven't been proven. And also, without a federal framework, they can't really be accurately studied. There's going to be things that constantly taint the data, that come in, that blow your statistics out of the water. So that's why I didn't address the specific one.
Any other questions in the audience? That was specifically for the progressives due to the question you got asked just for you earlier. In the front, in the blue shirt.
One thing that you mentioned, I was asking for, well, you mentioned one point, which is the black market, which is sort of the illegal dealing process of guns in America. However, one thing I found contradictory is that isn't more gun control laws going to make the black market thrive? In the sense of, you know, you have more control. However, people who wanted a gun illegally would tend to buy them from the black market. Similar to a situation where, you know, legalization of marijuana, you know, where marijuana is legalized, there's a drop in the black market instead of, you know, thriving.
Is for us? Yes, for us, I guess. I'll start and you can finish. Essentially, let's look at, like, instead of it, let's change the context of it for a second and say you wanted to buy, like, nuclear weapons are worth a lot of money, right? Everybody wants a nuclear weapon, but do we want everybody to have a nuclear weapon? I don't think so, right? Same thing goes for specific types of weapons.
You can't use a nuclear weapon in self-defense.
Please let the debater finish their response.
You can, actually. That's what we do in other countries, technically. Right?
Personal self-defense.
So
Obviously, the state can.
So,
silly.
yeah. So, like, the degree of firepower you need for self-defense, for hobby, or for hunting is not that really great. You can probably control for that factor. And I understand the black market aspect. I agree with you. I'm always worried about, like, if you ban something or, like, take something out of circulation that people tend to be fond of, it'll go up in value and there'll be more crime in favor of it. But we're the ones who bring all the guns. Like, we're the manufacturers of the weapons. And also, like, guns and drugs are a little bit different in that drugs are addictive. So you, like, want to keep coming back to drugs. A gun, like, you can probably live without a Uzi, right?
All right, to quickly answer that, for one, the Republican Party is not in favor of, you know, anyone having a recreational McNuke, right? That's not the policy we're advocating. We are advocating you have a reasonable right to protect yourselves through firearms. Now let's go over their specific claim. I talked about Australia earlier, right, where you have these black markets coming out where you have a decrease in legal guns because they're purchasing these illegal guns, and we see in the statistics reflect that. Now, to go one step further, he said, well, you know, guns and drugs aren't comparable because guns aren't addictive. But the problem is guns are the mechanisms to drugs. Because drug dealers, people who are trying to get drugs, they need these weapons. So the problem is when you ban guns, you're only giving it to those criminals that need drugs. Whereas our side wants to also protect the legal citizen.
Sorry, we're going to be taking our last question at this time. If you have a question, please raise your hand now. The woman in the middle, go ahead.
Paula.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm kind of confused with progressive. So, one of the most recent shootings at the school, he got the gun legally. His mother knew he had a problem. The school knew. The police knew. The FBI knew. As far as I'm concerned, clearly this is a lack of responsibility with those leaders.
Right.
So, how would stronger gun control have solved that and have prevented him from doing that shooting? And I don't quite understand exactly, again, I'm confused about what
Include the racial aspect, please.
Sure. Okay, so, I mean, like I said, the more you can harden things, but you'll never leave the element of surprise. Like that, we still lose the first room. The federal system's largely underfunded. If I recall correctly, there hasn't been a director appointed to the ATF, and it's been almost 2 years. So if that system cannot do its job, if it's not funded, if it's not staffed, that's a problem. The local authorities wouldn't be any better at it. I don't see how. I mean, we'd probably have to go into more specifics at that point. Sorry.
Oh, also, may I add on to this, that part of it also goes down to racial profiling, I think, is that they don't believe, or they don't tend to feel like certain demographics are as likely to commit crimes as other demographics are. And so if that kind of creates an internal blind spot, because you think like, oh, when you label somebody, this group of people are terrorists versus this is like an American, right? But they're both in our country.
Thank you. We're going to give the opportunity to the Republicans to respond.
All right, so the question specifically posed had to do with how we could prevent that shooting or how that would work, and the answer is it wouldn't. My partner is going to bring up later about the Parkland incident that occurred. If we look at the recent incident in Florida, it also wouldn't have worked because we knew about a lot of these things. That's why we need to increase the culture behind reporting. The fact is we already know, and in a lot of these cases, like the FBI report that I cited in my speech, for instance, they knew that these occurrences were going to happen, and because of that, we could have prevented them. If you see something, you need to report it.
I agree.
Thank you, debaters. At this time, we'll be moving into the final focus, beginning with the progressives. You have 3 minutes. Time begins when you start talking.
They just want no policies. Oh, so is there closing statements?
Yeah.
Okay. You go and I'll just finish up.
Sure. All right. When we debate something as nuanced as this, it's very important, it's essential that we can confine our arguments to what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. We're not talking about hyperbole here. We're talking about better reporting mechanisms. We're talking about better safety. We're talking about improved background checks, things like this. People can slip through. There's no such thing as a completely secure system. Security is largely an illusion at that point. You can't account for every variable. What we're talking about is, in general, decreasing the amount of regulation on guns at the local and state level, who many of these jurisdictions are trying to preempt federal policy. And you drive in your car somewhere and your firearm, you just became a criminal for transporting that. I don't think that's okay. In some ways, to me, it's like the issue of gay marriage. You go into another state, your marriage is invalidated. In this case, your rights to self-defense and your property is invalidated. So I don't want that to happen anymore. I want responsible gun owners to be able to exercise that freely, and people who should not have weapons to limit that. We have an unscrupulous industry that pumps a lot of these weapons in the streets. They're not aware, and nor would they approve, of the very small minority of sellers whose weapons are found at crime scenes and is swept up as part of investigations. The idea that other types of crime in other types of countries I find to be facile and irrelevant to the United States.
And I'll add in that while all guns can kill, they do not kill equally. And additionally, we are arguing for a consistent series of laws so that we don't have like a patchwork within the different states. So like they kind of invalidate and undermine each other's goals. Because the goal is public safety. It's like we want all the states to be able to be safe places, but if one's creating opposite rules to the other, it kind of makes it really difficult to achieve that goal. And then last but not least, we want to address this problem because it is something that's an unethical problem. Like it's something that's unethical. Lack of gun reform is unethical, is impractical, and irresponsibly dangerous. We can have guns and still have a society that functions safely, but we don't need to have all the liberty. All liberties are like to an extent. Even the First Amendment has restrictions. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, you will be punished for it. So yeah, that's all we're asking is like give the Fed the power to do that.
At this time, we'll be entertaining the final speech of the evening. The Republicans have the floor for 3 minutes.
I'd like to begin by thanking the Progressive Student Alliance for coming here and debating us today. We should definitely do
Thank
this
you.
more often. But I would also like to point out that during the entirety of your debate, you didn't cite a single study, no specifics, and they basically want you to follow them and their ideas blindly, promising that they'll keep you safe without backing that up with anything concrete. They cite hyperboles on things that could potentially happen that have no basis in actual reality, and they self-confirm their opinions. And we'd love to argue studies with you, but you don't have any. You're not rebutting our empirics, you're just citing intangibles and talking about giving vague power to the government. And vague power to the government has failed on many, many occasions. Most recently, the Parkland shooting, where the FBI was warned multiple times, the local police was warned multiple times, and guess what they did? Nothing. You're arguing to give them more power over this as if that's going to solve all the problems. Bigger government is not the solution here. The solution is to have the people empowered, the individuals empowered, so that the individuals can do something about it, because we cannot rely on anybody to protect us but ourselves. You can't address any specifics, and you say that you can't address our statistics because they'll just blow us out of the water. I really find that hard to believe, because you didn't blow us out of the water once. In fact, you didn't rebut any of our empirics or studies that we've listed this entire time. And you also argued for the government, for that, all these programs and stuff, the reason why they fail is because they're underfunded. We've seen time and time again that throwing money at problems and throwing money at things doesn't solve the issue. Just look at the state that California is in. Guns. You said that not all guns kill equally. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. So place the blame where it's due, not on the law-abiding, respectable, reliable gun owners, but on the people who break the law, on the people who have these mental issues. Instead of placing the blame at the feet of the majority of Americans who are law-abiding and respectful citizens of this country. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, debaters. Thank you, audience. I'm going to conclude by saying that we have the room until 9 o'clock, and we strongly encourage you to take the time to talk to each other, and as the professor said at the beginning, try to talk to someone who shares the exact opposite of your viewpoint. Thank you.